Joe, and thank you very much for coming on this bleak evening. I've been in Edinburgh now for 9 years, but my links to this city and this university go back further than that. My father undertook a PhD here back in the 1960s, and he, along with my mother and two sisters and I, spent a lovely 3 years keeping out of his way while he was writing his thesis. He studied theology and Islamic studies here in Edinburgh, and last week I checked the title of his thesis in the library catalogue, and it read, "The Role of Theophany in the Formation of Scripture in Early Israel and in the Quran." Now I quickly checked the Oxford English Dictionary, and it tells me that theophany means something like a manifestation or appearance of God or gods to a man or man. Now the title of my lecture clearly this evening pales by comparison. There will be little in the way of theophany this evening, I'm afraid. But that said, there is something about the contrast, about the grand theological themes that my father once tackled, and the everydayness of spoons and cities and everyday lives that we lead in cities, which I think is relevant. And the work of architecture, I think, traverses precisely this terrain between the grand and the ordinary. But in doing so, it always risks slipping from the sublime to the ridiculous. And this is something that we see in the conjunction of the spoon and the city in the same sentence. And I think this reminds us of this kind of risk. How architecture manages this movement between the grand and the ordinary, between the sublime and the ridiculous, is one of the themes that I want to explore this evening. And I'll do that by beginning by trying to unpack this phrase a little bit, the spoon to the city. And I want to do that as a means of thinking about what architecture and design have to say about the city in this time of globalization. So we'll begin by looking at some spoons, how could I not, with this title, and then we'll move into consideration of the city. And the city that I want to focus on is the city of Jakarta. It's one of the world's largest conurbations. It's a place that I've worked over a number of years now. And I think importantly, is a city that poses special challenges for what the city is and what a city might become. So this is not merely about Jakarta, I would argue, and I hope to show it's about a wider issue about urbanization in the time of globalization. So the lecture will have some reflections on spoons and cities. Then we will go to Jakarta visually at least, and I will try and describe some of the terrain of the work that I've been doing. And then we will come back and look at the exhibition that Joe mentioned in Rotterdam last year, where much of that work was curated and presented for the first time. So the architect designs everything from the spoon to the city. This is a provocative line, of course, but it's also a little bit unaccountable. It's been attributed to various people. Some say that William Morris first used the term, and others say that the early promoter of the arts and crafts in Germany, Hermann Matthias, also used the term. Others, on the other hand, suggest that it was a modernist slogan. Walter Gropius apparently used it as a personal motto, and he used it as a theme to underpin his pedagogical program when he taught at the Harvard Design School following World War II. Others also say that Mies van der Rohe, in fact, invented and owns the term. In Italy, curiously, the slogan circulates in another way. Here it's often attributed to post-war modernist architect Ernesto Rogers, happens to be the long-lost nephew of Richard Rogers. And also some people attribute to Massimo Vignelli, who's an important product designer in the Italian scene. So it's one of those phrases that seems to drift through the disciplinary discourse without any particular accountability. It's attributed to arch-modernists on the one hand, and also to arts and crafts zealots on the other. In other words, it's deployed in the name of antithetical causes with the same force. Now, the idea that architects would literally aspire to work both at the scale of the spoon and the city is something that remains, I think, quite prevalent in design discourse, but curiously unaccountable, which is one of the reasons why I think it's interesting to think about this evening. Now, it's not very hard to find examples of very good architects doing just this, designing spoons and cities, if not cities, then pieces of cities. And here's one such example. This is the work of French architect Jean Nouvel, his coffee spoon on the left, of 2003, and his recently opened one new chain shopping centre in the shadow of St Paul's in London. This is the work of Dutch architect Villaraetz, a set of 4 spoons. and his competition entry for the vast Waterland Urban Development project of 2003 in Shanghai. And the third of these images, this is an image showing the Bettina Table Service and the Bullring Shopping Centre in Birmingham. Both of these are by Future Systems architects. The Bullring complex, whatever your view is of the architecture, in fact has been very important in the regeneration of Birmingham, so really could be understood to be a kind of city designing exercise. Now the complexity of the relationship of the building to the city is matched by the complexity of this cladding system. Some 15,000 spun aluminium discs now adorn this building. But as you can also see, Future Systems are not doing just spoons but cutlery. And we can also see that this obviously leads us into a terrain where we know that many architects design many different consumer products. I'm sure some of you have coffee pots by Aldo Rossi, perhaps, those of you from the 80s, teapots, pepper grinders. Zaha Hadid has recently released a set of shoes which look very much like her recent museum in Rome. We can think of tables, and of course, most famously, architects are involved in designing chairs. In fact, chairs have held a very important place in the discipline for many years, probably more recognizable than spoons, I think, as the output of architectural work. Many of you, for example, will recognize perhaps the zigzag chair by Gerrit Rietveld, the ladder chair by Charles René Mackintosh, the chaise longue by Le Corbusier and his collaborator, the Eames chair and ottoman. It's a kind of game in architecture in a way to test your loyalty to the discipline in many ways. There are so many of these well-known chairs that identifying them quickly and accurately has become a kind of disciplinary test. In fact, chair identification tests your ability to see as an architect in quite a literal way. Again, most of my knowledge runs out after about the third line here, so I'm not a proper practicing architect. So we can see that the Spoon to City slogan clearly has something to do with jumping scales. It's also to do with collapsing graduated forms of attention, sequences of information, such that we become shocked by the contrast. We can never imagine a spoon in a city in the same frame of reference, and yet that's precisely what architects and designers try to do. The slogan also suggests a sense of heightened identification between designer and designer objects. Many of these chairs now reside in the living rooms of architects, clearly. So the identity of the architect, in a way, is intimately related to the objects of their craft, and this is often taken to extremes. You may well know that there's a long history of star architects over-identifying with the building, especially through fashion, for example. As we can see here in the image on the left, this is a very famous image, shows New York's finest architects at the Beaux-Arts Ball, held in that city in 1931. Now, if you don't recognize the characters from the left, Stuart Walker as the Fuller Building, Leonard Schultz as the Waldorf Astoria next to him, Elijah Kahn as the Squibb Building, but you are likely probably to recognize William Van Allen as the Chrysler Building in the middle there, primarily because he's gone to such great effort to dress up as his building. The image, on the other hand, on the far right, is more recent. It shows Zaha Hadid accepting her RIBA Sterling Prize Award last year. And below is an external view of the National Museum of the 21st Century Art in Rome, for which she was architect. And again, there are obvious kind of formal resonances, if you like, between her dress sense and her building sense. For all the fun I think that we can have with the Spoon to City principle, in fact, as I suggested earlier, this remains embedded as a deep, foundational, and interestingly unaccountable principle in the fabric of mainstream architectural and serious architectural practice. So it doesn't take much looking around, for example, to look at the work of Foster Partners, perhaps the leading firm in the UK and a very significant global practice. And this is from the front page of their website, where they say right up front, we work from the scale of the airport down to the detail of the door handle. So granted, door handle to airport doesn't have quite the same ring as Spoon to City, but it's exactly the same idea. And they're not embarrassed to have a full page spread of a door handle on the very next page of their website. It's roughly the same idea. It's the same point about scales, the shock of bringing them together in the same sentence. It also activates, I think, a sense of excess, the idea somehow that you would lavish this attention on a door handle Clearly an airport would warrant that kind of attention, but a door handle, really? Is this really the architect kind of straying out of their kind of natural terrain into the space of excess, of fetishism, and dare I say it, fashion? On the other hand, we can think of another practice, also globally significant, but of a more avant-garde colouring, perhaps, OMA, whose principal is the famous architect Rem Koolhaas, perhaps more famous than his firm. Some architects like OMA have played precisely with this idea of small and large scales, the essential and the excessive, and the shock about bringing them together in a singular context. This recent competition entry by OMA tackles a 40-hectare site in Hong Kong. It's one of the world's most prestigious sort of current competitions. In fact, they just missed out to Foster's, so they're both going for the same kinds of jobs. And they approach this through a very complex, way beyond architectural scale in its complexity. So this is a full-blown urban project that involves many disciplinary interactions. And they've thematized, again, I think famously, many of you will know this book, will thematize their own work in a book that is called Small, Medium, Large, and Extra Large. And here they set out various strategies and instances where their own work jumps scales, brings about the kind of shock of these varying kind of scalar conditions in their working practice. In doing so, they also, I think, broach other possibilities that this scale jumping idea allows. Along their way, they activate various interdisciplinary relationships as well, which I think is an interesting feature of their work. To do so, OMA have generated a twin identity as a means of developing this interdisciplinary possibility. So OMA has spawned AMO, which, as the website Blurred puts it, operates in areas beyond the traditional bounds of architecture, including media, politics, sociology, renewable energy, technology, and fashion, curating, and graphic design. So in their hands, in the hands of OMA, the Spoon to City slogan begins to seem a little bit more generous, a little bit less threatening perhaps, and a little bit more open. Now I think they sustain its ambition and shock by juxtaposing on the one hand a blatantly fashion-oriented project like this. This is again all done under the banner of AMO, so it's somehow insulated from their mainstream architectural practice. Blatantly fashion-oriented project, in this case for Miu Miu, and they juxtapose this against projects like this, which is a comprehensive report on renewable energy sources globally with the World Wildlife Fund. So here it's not only city, but there's a global aspiration to their work, which again I think scares a lot of people, and I think it's a kind of fear that we should try and investigate a little bit further. But for the moment, I think it's the same kind of idea that they're operating with. On the one hand, the sheer ephemerality of fashion, but on the other hand, to try and tackle something as ambitious as the title of this report would suggest. Also, importantly, it's properly interdisciplinary. This is a multi-programmed, a multi-stakeholder kind of project, as is in fact the fashion project. Now, before we get too carried away, of course, it's very important to kind of acknowledge that this idea of comprehensiveness in a way that the Spoon to a City slogan invites us to engage with, in fact, has been critiqued many times. The most famous, and I think still the most resonant critique, was made 110 years ago by Viennese architect Adolf Loos. In his famous essay, Poor Little Rich Man, first published in 1900, Loos tells us the tale of an obsessive architect who overextended himself in the design for a house for a rich and aspirational client. Loos writes this: each room formed a symphony of colours, complete in itself. Walls, wall coverings, furniture, and materials were made to harmonise in the most artful ways. Each household item had its own specific place and was integrated with the others in the most wonderful combination. The architect had forgotten nothing, absolutely nothing. Cigar ashtrays, cutlery, I think we can assume spoons there, light switches, everything was made by him. In every ornament, in every form, in every nail was the individuality of the owner to be found. Now, I'm sure you know this story, because difficulties then arose as soon as the client had a birthday. Being concerned about where to place the birthday gifts that the client had received from his family, he dutifully consulted his architect. And the architect retorted, How dare you presume to receive gifts? Didn't I drop everything for you? Haven't I taken care of everything? You need nothing more. You are complete. I think you get the sense of the threat of that spoon to city phrase in exactly this kind of expression. And Adolf Loos's essay is famous precisely for this ability to see through and puncture these kind of curious fascinations that architects have about total control. Now, I think this is a salutary warning still, some 100 years later after it was first published. So perhaps we can recap at this moment before we move on to thinking a little bit more about some projects and changing tone a little bit. Let's recap the argument so far with Loos's tale in mind, but also keeping this image in mind, which I think is a very helpful one to go with it. This image, of course, is again Le Corbusier's hand. We assume it's Le Corbusier's hand, wafting over the plan voisin for Paris, and it's one of the most infamous images in architecture, and I think, in fact, it's not so infamous in architecture. It's infamous beyond architecture, and part of its infamy lies in the sense that the hand that designs furniture, that designs cutlery, that designs pepper shakers, is also the agent of rationality and a kind of indifferent agent sweeping across the historical fabric of Paris in the name of his new rationally calculated high-rise urban fabric. This is literally an image of a high-handed architect. Now, the promise of the spoon to city slogan holds is the idea that the order, if we kind of put this to one side for a moment, the idea that the world might be ordered, that it might be coordinated, and even might be designed in a way that allows the logic of the small to be relevant to the logic of the large. That it somehow promotes a kind of integrated relationality, even, to use a contemporary term, to think about an all-encompassing view that keeps the large and the small in some kind of tune. But today, of course, the sheer complexity of cities, and cities is the object of this inquiry, of course, makes this promise seem very naive, it seems to me. And the slogan might also, I think, as you would have gathered, as the Italian critic put it, Angelo Cortesi, as he put it, the phrase makes a lot of people nervous. But what makes people nervous, I think, and I'd be interested to talk to you over drinks about this, but what makes people nervous, I think, is not the relationship of the small to large, but I think it's the other part of the slogan. It's the part that says, the architect designs. Perhaps it's even the everything that's especially troubling here. The complexity of cities today simply puts them beyond the reach of most planning agencies. So to imagine a single agent, such as an architect, operating at the level of the city is quite disturbing. And we can add here that the word design is also troubling in this context, as it means a kind of all-encompassing practice. Nothing is safe from design, we might object. But I also want to argue that this phrase, which is so beguiling for many architects and so troubling for others, also contains a curious kind of potential. And this is the sort of main hypothesis, I guess, that I would like to test. The potential, I think, involves what I've been calling scale jumping, not filling in all the scales, but precisely short-circuiting the scales, to deploy yet another metaphor. This short-circuiting of scales, I think, has a capacity to complicate expected default relationships, default sequences, logical arrangements, things that we expect already to be in place. In the right context, with the right caveats, with a knowing practice, this practice of short-circuiting scales, I think, suggests a very creative and valuable way of working. Now, of course, the city as an object of inquiry and as site of intervention is, of course, vastly more complicated than the bourgeois interior that Adolf Loos mocked. And we can see that. This is the infamy of this project resides in precisely that simplicity, that simple attitude to the urban fabric. So for the second part of this lecture, I'd like now to turn to the city as a way of testing and extending this kind of rudimentary hypothesis.